A young couple, expecting their first child, embarked on what they hoped would be a peaceful weekend getaway. One last adventure before parenthood transformed their world. Jenna Dinger, 7 months pregnant, and her husband, Marcus, had chosen Joshua Tree National Park for its vast, starry skies and the quiet solitude of the desert. Before their signal vanished, they sent a single photograph, an image frozen in time, filled with love, excitement, and the tranquility of an evening under the open sky. It would be the last anyone heard from them. For over a decade, their disappearance remained one of the most haunting cold cases in California. Friends and relatives clung to hope, desperate for any scrap of news, while law enforcement cycled through countless leads that went nowhere. Glimpses of a van on distant highways, blurry photos of strangers mistaken for Marcus or Jenna, and endless speculation that twisted into dead ends. That was until a lone hiker stumbled upon something half buried in the sand in a remote corner of the park that few ever dared to explore. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigative community. Detectives, who had nearly given up, were suddenly retracing their steps, re-examining the evidence they had dismissed, now seen in a harrowing new light. It all began with a silent ping, a satellite connection triggered by a brief moment of service, a signal that had once comforted Jenna's younger sister Chloe, and would now become central to the search for truth. Back then, Chloe had been relieved when the notification appeared on her phone screen. It meant Jenna and Marcus were okay. The Starlink device they brought along had worked, even out in the unforgiving wilderness of Joshua Tree. The photo that arrived seconds later painted a picture of pure happiness. Jenna glowing in a cerulean blue maternity sweater, seated with a hand resting gently on her belly in front of a bright lime green tent. Marcus crouched behind her, arm wrapped around her shoulders, a grin stretching beneath his thick beard. They looked content, connected, ready to face the next chapter together. To Chloe, the image was everything. A snapshot of joy, the culmination of months of planning and a lifetime of dreams. Shortly after the photo, Jenna had sent a text. "All set up for the night. The desert is beautiful. Love you." Chloe had instantly replied with heart emojis and a gentle nudge to keep hydrated. It was a simple, loving exchange, something only sisters could share. Later that evening, Chloe went to bed with that image vivid in her mind. Her sister safe under a sky filled with stars, her husband by her side. But that was yesterday. Now, as the sun carved long amber shadows across the walls of her living room, the silence from the desert had taken on an ominous weight. There had been a plan. Jenna was supposed to call by noon the next day, just to check in. A compromise born of Chloe's anxiety over her sister roughing it in the wilderness, while so far along in her pregnancy. The couple had a camper van for comfort, but Chloe's worry never fully rested. Noon passed quietly. Chloe reassured herself with excuses. Maybe they'd slept in. Maybe a short hike had taken longer than expected. Perhaps the satellite signal was unreliable. Still, the unease had begun to scratch at her thoughts. By 1 o'clock, she was checking her phone compulsively. By 3 o'clock, dread was creeping in. When 5 o'clock arrived with no word, fear took hold. She dialed Jenna's number, straight to voicemail. She tried Marcus. Same result. Her eyes drifted back to the photo, now tinged with something cold. What once captured happiness now felt eerie. The desert behind them looked endless and isolating. The camper van, which had symbolized safety and preparation, now stood out as a lifeless, hollow container. Why hadn't they moved to a spot with reception? Why hadn't they driven into town or messaged again? As night approached, each unanswered question tightened the knot in her stomach. Something wasn't right. Shaking, Chloe searched for the National Park Service's non-emergency contact for Joshua Tree. The voice on the line was calm, measured. She explained everything. Jenna's pregnancy, their last communication, the white Ram Pro Master van, the coordinates they had likely chosen. She forwarded the photo, the only tangible proof of their presence, The ranger's tone remained reassuring, but the urgency beneath his words was unmistakable. By dusk, 2 rangers were dispatched into the park, their vehicle cutting through the vast, desolate terrain with headlights slicing across ancient rock formations and dense creosote scrub. They knew the Dingers preferred isolated campsites, away from the bustling public campgrounds. It took nearly an hour navigating from paved roads onto hard-packed desert paths before their searchlights caught a glimpse of something familiar. Illuminated in stark white beams was the exact scene Chloe had described. The white van sat motionless, parked on level sand. Not far away, the green tent stood firm against the night wind, as though nothing had changed. The image from the photo had come to life, but with one terrifying omission. There were no people. Stepping cautiously, their boots crunching against dry gravel, the rangers approached. "Mr. Dinger? Mrs. Dinger?" one called out, voice echoing into the emptiness. Nothing answered except the wind rustling through brittle brush. The campsite seemed untouched. 2 chairs faced an unlit fire pit, their placement suggesting a moment interrupted. The tent was zipped closed. Inside, they found sleeping bags unrolled, pillows in place, empty, undisturbed. The van doors were locked tight. It was as if the couple had vanished into thin air. With dawn's first light, the sight transformed into something far more sinister. The peaceful tableau was now a scene of dread, marked by yellow police tape that stood in harsh contrast to the timeless desert around it. County sheriff's deputies arrived, joined by crime scene specialists. What had started as a welfare check had escalated into a full-scale investigation. Priority 1, gain access to the camper van, now the central focus. It stood like a sealed vault in the middle of the mystery. Rather than risk damaging potential evidence by breaking a window, investigators made a calculated decision. They called in a locksmith. The meticulous care underscored their hope that somewhere inside might lie the first real clue in a story that had, until now, been defined by silence. As the locksmith crouched beside the van, working methodically to disengage the lock without causing damage, the lead detective stood nearby, arms folded, his gaze sweeping across the eerily pristine campsite. Years of working cases in the rugged and remote corners of the Southwest had given him a sixth sense for when something felt wrong, and everything about this scene felt too orderly. In his experience, wilderness disappearances left behind signs of chaos, a campsite torn apart by panic, scattered belongings hinting at struggle, or the tragic remnants of an animal encounter. But this felt curated, sanitized. The desert wind carried only silence, interrupted abruptly by the metallic pop of the lock giving way. The van's sliding door opened with a metallic sigh, revealing the custom interior built for off-grid comfort. Investigators approached slowly, flashlights cutting arcs across the space. What they saw inside only deepened the mystery. The camper's small but carefully organized living quarters looked untouched, as if preserved in a time capsule. A double bed at the rear of the van was immaculately made, the corners tucked with precision. On the kitchenette's compact counter, a bag of trail mix was clipped neatly closed, half empty. A full bottle of water sat beside it, untouched. On a small side shelf, 2 wallets lay side by side. Marcus and Jenna Dinger's identification was present. Driver's licenses, credit cards, and several $100s in cash. Next to them was an older model flip phone, presumably for emergencies. A bottle of prenatal vitamins sat beside it, the bright label facing forward, untouched since it was last placed there. The symbolism was heavy. This van wasn't a crime scene. It was a shrine to a life interrupted. One of the investigators, wearing gloves, gingerly opened the wallets. Nothing appeared out of place. The licenses confirmed their identities. Cash was intact. Not a single item had been rifled through. No signs of theft. This level of preservation, this completeness, was a clue in itself. People who run away take their wallets. People who wander off often carry water and essentials. And no loving husband, no matter how disoriented, would leave behind his pregnant wife's vital prenatal medication. The conclusion struck everyone with chilling clarity. The Dingers had not left voluntarily. They had fully intended to return. Only 3 things were missing: the couple themselves, the clothes they had been wearing, and the smartphone used to send the final photo and text. There were no signs of violence inside the van. Nothing overturned, no damage, no blood. No scuffed surfaces or torn fabric. It was as if someone had opened the door, called their names, and they had calmly stepped into the desert, never to return. As park rangers and volunteers began the painstaking process of gridding the surrounding terrain, an exhausting, often disheartening task in a landscape riddled with canyons, caves, and sun-baked rock formations, detectives turned their focus to the couple's digital footprint. Their goal: reconstruct the lives Marcus and Jenna had left behind. At first glance, their background told a familiar story. Jenna was a respected elementary school teacher who had recently taken a leave of absence to prepare for the arrival of their baby. She was adored by students and colleagues alike. Marcus was a business consultant, self-employed, seemingly well-liked and sociable. The two were described as affectionate, grounded, and excited for parenthood. On paper, their lives mirrored the camper's interior: organized, stable, idyllic. But detectives knew better than to trust surface appearances. 2 days into the investigation, a financial crime specialist assigned to dig into the couple's accounts uncovered the first major crack in that carefully curated life. Their shared checking and savings accounts were healthy, and credit reports showed nothing alarming. But Marcus, it turned out, had a second financial life. One invisible to Jenna. Buried behind layers of alternative lending networks and hard-to-trace digital transactions, Marcus had accumulated an alarming volume of high-interest debt. Not from banks or standard credit unions, but from hard money lenders, outfits known for lending fast and collecting aggressively. It was the kind of borrowing that suggested desperation, and Marcus was out of time. Payment schedules showed he was on the brink of defaulting. Missed payments had already triggered warning notices from at least 2 lenders. Suddenly, Marcus wasn't just a missing person. He was a man under extreme, secret financial pressure. The psychological toll that kind of hidden debt could exact on someone was immense. A chilling possibility began to form. Had Marcus planned to vanish? Was this entire trip, this so-called baby moon, merely a staged retreat? A ruse to mask a final, desperate act? The theory gained traction with disturbing speed. Detectives constructed a narrative, one they hoped was wrong. Perhaps Jenna had only recently discovered the debt. Perhaps that knowledge triggered a confrontation in the quiet isolation of the desert. Perhaps emotions ran high and things escalated. Perhaps Marcus, seeing no other way out, had committed an unthinkable act, buried the truth in the sand, and fled. The theory gained further weight when a tip came in from a gas station in a small, dusty town over 100 miles from Joshua Tree. The Be on the Lookout bulletin had circulated to rural areas throughout the state. A graveyard shift clerk saw Marcus's picture and felt a chill. He remembered the man. It was 2 nights after the couple had gone silent. He looked rattled, the clerk recalled. Kept glancing over his shoulder, like he was waiting for someone to catch up to him. The man paid for gas in crumpled bills, avoided eye contact, and purchased a cheap burner phone. But what stood out most was the map, a detailed paper road atlas of the American Southwest. In an age where digital GPS ruled, it was a strangely analog choice. But it made sense. A burner phone, a paper map, tools for someone who didn't want to be tracked. Though the clerk couldn't say with absolute certainty it was Marcus, the resemblance was strong. For investigators, it felt like the final piece snapping into place. A husband burdened by secret debt, a wife possibly on the verge of discovering it, a remote setting, a timeline that offered Marcus nearly 2 full days to escape into the vast expanse of the Southwest. The picture became gruesomely clear. Something had gone terribly wrong in the desert, and Marcus had fled into the shadows of the wilderness. Delivering this theory to Jenna's family was the worst part of the job. The lead detective visited Chloe at her home. He laid out the facts with careful restraint, explaining the discovery of Marcus's debt, the possible sighting at the gas station, and the implications. As he spoke, Chloe's expression shifted from tense hope to blank disbelief, and then to rage. She stood up abruptly, her body trembling with fury, face flushed. "You're saying he did this?" she demanded. "You think my sister's lying out there in the desert because of him?" Her voice cracked. The detective offered no easy answers, only facts. Cold, unrelenting facts. Outside, the sky darkened into twilight, mirroring the storm now raging inside her heart. "No," Chloe said, her voice trembling as she rose from the edge of the couch, fists clenched by her sides. "Absolutely not. Not Marcus." Tears welled in her eyes as she faced the detective, her words tumbling out, breathless but unwavering. She spoke not just with grief, but with conviction, her mind replaying the tender moments she had witnessed over the past months. How Marcus had spent hours in the garage, sanding, staining, and assembling a crib entirely by hand. The kind of detail only a man deeply committed to fatherhood would pursue. How he read aloud to Jenna's belly every night, performing characters with silly voices, already connecting with the tiny life they hadn't yet met. She recalled how he broke down in tears when they saw their baby's heartbeat on the ultrasound monitor for the first time. "That's not the kind of man who runs," she insisted, her voice breaking. "That's a man who is sprinting toward his future, not away from it." She wiped the tears streaking down her face, but kept going, her tone turning sharper. "You're wrong," she repeated, staring down the detective. "He would die for her. He would never hurt her. He's not your suspect. He's a victim too." And in that emotionally charged moment, two opposing narratives split away from one another, irreconcilable and irreparable. In the eyes of law enforcement, Marcus Dinger was now their #1 suspect. A fugitive who may have orchestrated a disappearance to escape mounting financial despair, perhaps even committing a darker crime in the process. But to his family, to Chloe, Marcus was a second casualty, missing, not monstrous. She believed the authorities were squandering precious time and resources chasing a man who wasn't running but had instead been taken, or silenced. As weeks dragged on, the frenzied momentum behind the search dwindled. The helicopters, the search dogs, the daily press briefings, all began to disappear like footprints in shifting desert sand. Summer's oppressive heat returned, scorching the very ground where the lime-green tent had once stood. And when winter came, cold desert nights settled over Joshua Tree, with only coyotes and wind moving through the silent brush. The yellow tape that had once cordoned off the Dingers' campsite was long gone, taken down after forensic teams packed up and moved on. Nature quietly reclaimed the space, erasing nearly all signs that a profound tragedy had once taken root there. No plaques, no markers. Just sand and silence. At the sheriff's office, the once bustling Dinger case folder, filled with witness statements, photographs, and unconfirmed tips, was first moved from an active desk to a drawer. Then, over time, from that drawer to a remote shelf in the records room. Thick with unanswered questions and dead-end leads, the file was reclassified as what investigators feared most: a cold case. To the public, the story faded. New headlines took over the news cycle. Fresh tragedies demanded attention. But for Chloe, there was no moving on. No distraction could dull the ache. Each day without answers was like reliving the loss anew. She refused to let her sister and Marcus become a footnote in someone else's archive. She emailed, called, and visited the sheriff's department relentlessly. She demanded updates that never came. She pleaded with new detectives to look beyond the surface, to question the assumptions that had tainted the investigation from the beginning. The idea that Marcus was some cold, calculating killer felt like a lazy conclusion, a convenient theory that let the system off the hook. Chloe pointed to the total lack of activity in his digital footprint. Not a single charge on his credit cards, no use of his social security number, no bank withdrawals, no new phone lines, no rental agreements, no surveillance sightings, no digital noise. "It's not the profile of someone who's hiding," she told one investigator. "It's the profile of someone who's gone." And she was right. After the initial questionable sighting at the rural gas station, not a single reliable trace of Marcus Dinger ever surfaced. He hadn't reached out to friends or family. No one reported seeing him in the US or abroad. He had vanished every bit as completely as Jenna. To Chloe, the silence wasn't strategic. It was final. She believed Marcus was dead, maybe the victim of a robbery gone wrong, or a third party they never knew existed. But no matter the theory, she was certain of one thing. Marcus hadn't left willingly. Years passed. 2012 became 2013, then 2014. A new sheriff was elected. The original lead detective retired. As fresh cases rolled in, the Dinger file gathered dust. Around the park, their story became local lore. A ghost tale whispered to curious hikers, a cautionary footnote printed on tourist blogs. Yet for law enforcement, it was something else. A stubborn, frustrating failure. A black mark. Then, in late summer 2017, nearly 6 years after that fateful weekend, a routine bureaucratic order breathed life back into the investigation. The Dingers' white Ram Pro Master camper van, which had languished in the county's impound lot for years, was finally slated for release. The storage fees were mounting, and legally, the county could no longer justify holding it. As next of kin, Chloe was notified that the vehicle would be returned or auctioned unless claimed. Before any vehicle could be cleared, however, department policy required one final comprehensive inventory. It was a mundane box to check. Evidence logs needed to match before a case asset could be officially declassified. The task fell to a young deputy, a methodical, detail-oriented officer who'd just been a rookie when the Dingers first vanished. The impound yard was hot, dry, and filled with decay. Row after row of dented and dust-choked vehicles sat under a hazy sun, each one abandoned, repossessed, or implicated in someone's worst day. The Dinger van was parked near the back, its once bright exterior dulled by layers of desert grime. The deputy opened the doors and stepped inside, clipboard in hand, retracing the old manifest. Sleeping bags, check. Camp stove, check. First aid kit, check. Every item is still in its place, like a time capsule frozen since 2011. The cabin's woodwork, crafted lovingly by Marcus, was still intact. As the deputy inspected a line of overhead cabinets, he noticed something odd. One vertical seam between the cabinets was too perfect. There was no visible gap, no minor misalignment, just a flawless, suspicious edge. He pressed gently. Nothing. He tapped. The sound changed. A soft, hollow knock, unlike the dense thud of solid wood. Heart beginning to race, he reached for his multi-tool and carefully inserted the thin flathead into the seam. Click! A magnetic latch gave way, and a hidden panel popped free, revealing a narrow cavity behind the cabinetry. It wasn't listed on any inventory. No one had noticed it before. He shone his flashlight inside. Lying diagonally within the space was a single object, a gray, waterproof map tube. The kind used by architects, cartographers, or engineers. It was sealed tightly, deliberately. No labels, no markings. The deputy lifted it from its hidden resting place, holding it like a rare artifact. This wasn't the aftermath of panic. This wasn't something dropped in a rush. This was methodical, intentional. Back at the sheriff's office, the discovery sent a wave of electricity through the cold case unit. After years of stagnation, they finally had something new, something concealed. Inside a sterile evidence processing room, the cap of the tube was slowly unscrewed. What secrets it held might finally explain what happened that night in the desert. A seasoned detective, a man who had been present in the earliest days of the Dinger case when every lead felt urgent and every clue seemed promising, now stood over the evidence table, a familiar sense of tension knotting his stomach. He had spent over a decade chasing ghosts, reviewing theories that went nowhere and navigating the cold, unyielding silence of the desert. Now, he carefully slid the rolled documents from the weatherproof tube. They weren't just maps. They were a revelation. One by one, he unrolled them across the wide metal table beneath the harsh white lights of the evidence room. These were not ordinary tourist maps bought at a roadside gas station. These were highly detailed, professionally printed geological surveys, thick paper, topographic grids, and overlays in precise ink. They covered a specific remote quadrant of Joshua Tree National Park, far from the maintained trails and well-known campgrounds. The region was notorious for its jagged rock formations, hidden canyons, and treacherous terrain. Only the most experienced hikers or researchers dared venture there. But it wasn't the maps themselves that truly captivated the investigators. It was what had been added to them. In the margins and across several key areas of the maps were dozens of handwritten notations, meticulously penciled in a tidy, technical script. The notes were dense with geological jargon, phrases like pegmatite dikes, check alluvium for float, and GPS coordinates annotated with possible monazite, a mineral often associated with rare earth elements. The room fell quiet as the implications settled over the team. This wasn't the work of a man preparing for a weekend of scenic hiking. These were the markings of someone prospecting, possibly illegally. Someone with a deep interest in the hidden mineral wealth beneath the desert floor. The prior theory, that Marcus had panicked, killed his wife and fled, suddenly felt fragile, simplistic. The man caught on grainy surveillance buying a roadside, atlas and a burner phone, a red herring, a ghost conjured by desperation. Had they misunderstood everything? The detectives reached out to a geology professor at a nearby university, a specialist in mineralogy, who reviewed the materials. His assessment was immediate and precise. The annotations were knowledgeable, more than just casual. Whoever had written them had a clear understanding of the local rock types, formations, and the principles of mineral extraction. Yet he described the work as sophisticated amateurism, not quite the precision of a trained geologist, but deeply informed nonetheless. The maps suggested something clandestine. Had Marcus Dinger stumbled onto a lucrative rare earth deposit? Had he been meeting someone in the backcountry for a secretive transaction? Or had he discovered something that got him killed? Investigators tried to trace the origin of the custom maps. A small printing company's logo in the bottom corner offered a lead, but it was yet another dead end. The business had closed its doors 5 years earlier, and all records, digital and physical, were gone. No forwarding contacts, no archived orders. Still, they acted on what they had. A targeted search operation was launched in the quadrant marked on the maps. For 3 exhausting days, a rotating team of rangers and volunteers scoured the unforgiving terrain. But the area was massive, crisscrossed with boulder fields, crevices, and dry washes that could conceal anything or nothing. No signs of recent activity were found. No tools, no campsites, no remains. The effort was eventually called off. The discovery of the maps had the impact of a thunderclap, but left behind no rain. It was a profound clue that raised far more questions than it answered. It neither cleared Marcus of suspicion nor confirmed it. What it did was crack the narrative wide open, introducing the possibility of a secret life that had nothing to do with financial ruin or familial betrayal. It hinted at danger, but from a source entirely unknown. The case file was updated again. Photos of the annotated maps were taken and the originals sealed in an evidence bag. The file, once a straightforward story of disappearance, had become a dense, bewildering mystery. The questions loomed larger than ever. Who was Marcus Dinger, really? What had he discovered out there? And why had he never returned? As the months passed and no new information emerged, the file returned to the shelf. Heavier and colder than before, it remained untouched through anniversaries and inquiries. 11 years had passed since the Dingers disappeared, and the desert had guarded its secrets well. Time moved on. By October 2022, Joshua Tree had resumed its quiet rhythm. Tourists filtered through the main campgrounds. Rangers patrolled the usual routes. The desert sun bleached the earth beneath it, while relentless winds shifted the topsoil, erasing footprints, reshaping dunes, and covering traces of the past. To the world, the Dingers were a distant memory, a cold case relegated to local lore and late-night mystery forums. But to Derek Vincent, none of that mattered. A 39-year-old software engineer from Seattle, Derek had grown tired of the Pacific Northwest's endless drizzle and needed clarity. He arrived in Joshua Tree seeking isolation, not answers. An avid solo hiker, he was familiar with desert navigation, preferring unmarked terrain over crowded trails. On this trip, he wasn't following a map. He was following his instinct. The morning was clear and cool, the air crisp under a cloudless sky. As he moved deeper into the wilderness, his only companions were the crunch of gravel underfoot and the occasional cry of a distant bird of prey. The rock formations towered around him, silent monuments to millennia. At some point, nature called. He scanned the horizon. Nothing but emptiness. He veered off course, spotting a cluster of large granite boulders that promised privacy. As he rounded one of the massive stones, something caught his eye. A subtle indentation in the earth, a depression where the soil looked oddly churned, as though disturbed recently. Coyotes, he assumed. They often dug in search of prey, but something about this spot made him pause. At the center of the disturbed soil, he saw a glint, white, dull, and matte. Not the shiny brightness of plastic, but the muted off-white hue of something older. He stepped closer, assuming it was litter, perhaps bone. Driven by a mix of irritation and curiosity, he nudged it with his hiking boot. The object shifted slightly, but what really caught his attention was the sand falling away around it, revealing more of the curve. It wasn't jagged. It was smooth, delicate, unmistakably organic. His stomach turned. He crouched. He leaned in. It wasn't just a bone. It was part of a rib cage, arched, fused, unmistakably human. He stumbled back in horror, heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. The desert fell unnaturally silent around him, like it was holding its breath. It was real. There, partially buried in the earth, were rows of human ribs, splayed outward like spokes in a fan. He scrambled for his phone, fingers numb with panic, clumsy against the screen. The air felt thick, distorted, unreal. He managed to dial. 911, he gasped. I found something, someone. The voice on the other end of the phone was calm, steady, a stark contrast to Derek Vincent's rising panic. It was the voice of someone trained to anchor others in moments like this. 911, what is your emergency? Found something, Derek stammered, his voice raw, fragile, almost breaking. I think it's a body. Bones. Human bones. The dispatcher's tone didn't change, a tether of professionalism holding the moment steady. Okay, sir, I understand. I'm here with you. Can you tell me your location? Derek blinked into the blinding midday sun, heart racing, eyes darting across the alien landscape. The same boulders and ridges that had earlier looked beautiful and majestic now felt menacing and surreal. The desert had shifted from a place of peace to one of dread. He tried to orient himself, to put into words what only made sense in instinct and memory. I'm about a mile, maybe more, from a dirt road, he said, voice trembling. I walked east, I think. There's a cluster of boulders, large granite ones, maybe 20 feet tall, shaped kind of like Like a horseshoe? The sun's to my left. I think I was headed east, or southeast. On the other end of the line, Derek could hear the clacking of a keyboard. The dispatcher was working to triangulate his position, piecing together his description against topographical data and satellite overlays. The seconds stretched unbearably. Derek felt like he was floating, disconnected from time. He was told to remain where he was, not to touch anything. Help was on its way. After ending the call, Derek walked about 50 feet from the shallow depression and sat on a smooth rock, his back turned to the scene. He couldn't look at it again. The image, the ghastly emergence of human ribs from the sand, was already etched permanently into his mind. He sat there in stunned silence, staring across the arid plains that once promised tranquility. His breathing slowed but never returned to normal. His hands trembled. Roughly 45 minutes later, the stillness was broken by the sound of engines growling over gravel. 2 park rangers in uniform approached, their demeanor composed but visibly alert. Derek stood up as they arrived and, in halting words, described what he had seen. The rangers nodded and moved toward the disturbed patch of earth. Their expressions darkened. This wasn't an old animal burial, and it wasn't someone's discarded camping supplies. It was undeniably human. Within minutes, the rangers had cordoned off the area with bright yellow tape, a jarring splash of artificial color against the neutral tones of the desert. A crime scene had been declared. Soon, sheriff's deputies arrived, followed by a white van bearing the county's forensic investigation unit. At the center of the team was the lead forensic archaeologist, a seasoned expert whose skin was bronzed and lined by decades under the desert sun. Her eyes were sharp, analytical, and guarded by experience. She took command without fanfare, issuing soft-spoken orders with the authority of someone who had excavated truths from the earth many times before. This wasn't a recovery. This was an excavation. The process began immediately. Tarps were unfurled, equipment cases opened. Her team worked with the reverence of caretakers and the precision of surgeons. They established a detailed grid across the site. There were no shovels, only trowels, fine brushes, dental picks, and tweezers. Each grain of sand was moved deliberately, every layer documented and bagged. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the full picture began to emerge. What they uncovered was chilling in its clarity. A nearly complete skeleton lay curled in a shallow grave, the bones remarkably well preserved by the dry desert conditions. The position of the body was fetal, knees drawn toward the chest, arms curled inward. The skull was intact, facing westward. The eye sockets, hollow and dark, stared at nothing. The skeleton was clearly female, adult, and very likely had been buried in this spot for many years. As the team worked toward the pelvic region, the lead archaeologist suddenly paused. Something small and impossibly delicate had emerged beneath her brush. She knelt closer, motioning to her assistant. Nestled within the bowl of the woman's pelvic bones lay another skeleton, a miniature replica, a tiny, perfectly formed skull, its features ghost-like, a tiny rib cage, arms and legs no thicker than twigs. There, in the exact place where it had once been carried, was the fully intact skeleton of a fetus. The excavation site fell silent. Even the most experienced deputies looked away, overwhelmed by the intimacy of the scene. This wasn't just one death. It was 2. A mother and her unborn child, entwined forever in the silence of the desert. The remains were later confirmed to be those of Jenna Dinger. DNA from a preserved strand of hair matched her dental records and familial samples provided years before. The fetus, her child, was almost full term. News of the discovery hit the sheriff's department like a thunderclap. The Dinger file, once mothballed and practically forgotten, was instantly reopened. Jenna's disappearance was no longer shrouded in uncertainty. It was not an accident, not a wandering lost hiker. And the theory of a husband's impulsive act followed by flight, once accepted as the most logical, collapsed. This was a homicide. And more importantly, this was a planned burial in one of the most isolated, inhospitable parts of the park, accessible only to those who knew how to find it. A new task force was formed within days. Veterans who had worked the original investigation were paired with a new generation of officers fluent in digital forensics and advanced crime scene analysis. Their task was simple but daunting. Re-examine everything. Detective Miles Corbin, once a junior officer on the periphery of the case, now nearing retirement, volunteered to review the original files. For 3 straight days, he immersed himself in transcripts, evidence logs, and dusty reports, some still handwritten. Then, on day 3, he found something. It was a report from 2017, the discovery of the hidden compartment in the Dinger's camper van. Corbin remembered it vaguely. A sealed tube, geological maps, notations dismissed as strange but irrelevant. He pulled up the digital scans of those maps. His breath caught. One map had a large circle drawn around a quadrant of the park. Several GPS coordinates were scribbled in the margins, along with cryptic, mineralogical notes. He pulled the coordinates from the report of Jenna's grave site and ran the numbers. The grave lay exactly inside the circle. A direct match. That detail, the one no one had understood 6 years earlier, was now the linchpin. The maps weren't just speculative ramblings. They were a blueprint, a guide, a clue left not by a tourist, but by someone who had marked the very location of death. Marcus Dinger hadn't stumbled into the desert by accident. He had known exactly where he was going. The question was no longer whether Marcus Dinger had been present at the burial site. That was now a certainty. The real question, one that now defined the trajectory of the case, was why. Why had he gone there? And why had Jenna, heavily pregnant and full of life, followed him? While Detective Corbin pored over the past, threading together long-forgotten clues, the present-day effort focused on the forensic examination of Jenna and her unborn child. Their remains were transferred to the county medical examiner's office with the highest level of priority. The forensic anthropologist tasked with the case had handled difficult remains before, victims of exposure, disasters, even war. But this would be one of the most challenging of her career. 11 years of desert wind and blistering sun had wiped away all traces of soft tissue. What was left behind were bones, brittle, sun-bleached, silent. A full autopsy would yield no blood samples, no tissue impressions, and no signs of contusions or hemorrhaging. There would be no traditional autopsy photos. The body had been stripped by time down to its essence. Still, bones could speak, if you knew how to listen. The anthropologist began with a full visual inspection. She looked for telltale signs of violence, clean breaks in the long bones of the arms or legs, nicks in the ribs that might indicate stab wounds, depressions in the skull that could point to blunt force trauma. But Jenna's skeleton bore none of these. There were no cracks, no breaks, no notches, no trauma that could be readily identified with the naked eye. The bones were whole. She might have simply sat down one day and never gotten up. The forensic pathologist noted her findings, or lack thereof, and paused. But she wasn't ready to stop. The story was there, hidden deeper. She moved to the cervical vertebrae, the bones of the neck. In many strangulation cases, damage here was often too subtle to detect without aid. She took minuscule samples from the vertebrae, shaving off particles so small they were invisible to the naked eye, and prepared them for scanning electron microscopy, an advanced method that revealed surface changes and embedded particulates at a nearly atomic scale. It took hours, but what she found changed everything. Under the microscope, embedded within the matrix of the bone, were microscopic particles, metallic, dense, and granular. Not fragments of bone, not desert sand, but something foreign, something synthetic. The particles were ultrafine, far too consistent to be natural. They weren't part of the native soil composition. In fact, they didn't match any known geologic material from the Joshua Tree area. The substance appeared to have been introduced to the bone at or around the time of death. possibly inhaled or absorbed through trauma. It was a clue, a material fingerprint. A sample of the metallic dust was sealed in a forensic vial and rushed to a specialized lab, one that combined expertise in geochemistry and material science. Their task was deceptively simple: identify the substance and determine its origin. Now the investigation had two powerful tracks running in parallel. The first, the map. It proved conclusively that the grave wasn't chosen in panic or desperation. It had been pre-marked. It was a destination, a point of interest. Someone had brought Jenna there intentionally. The second, the dust. A microscopic anomaly, foreign to the environment, and perhaps the only physical evidence linking the killer directly to the body. The task force shifted focus. The old theory, that Marcus had snapped under the pressure of financial ruin, was dismantled. The new theory placed the couple in the desert for a reason rooted not in domestic conflict, but in something buried beneath the surface. Literally. They started combing through Marcus's professional history with renewed urgency. The financial records that had once painted him as a desperate man now hinted at something else entirely. The debts remained, but the source of those debts told a different story. The consulting firm Marcus had co-founded had collapsed just before the disappearance. The records showed a string of aggressive financial maneuvers initiated not by a faceless bank or a mobster, but by one man, Leland Croft, Marcus's former partner. Croft's name had appeared in the original investigation. Back in 2011, he had given a brief statement expressing sadness and surprise over Marcus's disappearance. He confirmed the breakup of their business and had characterized it as a tense but ultimately amicable parting. At the time, the interview had barely registered. Investigators were focused on tracking Marcus, a presumed fugitive. Croft's connection seemed peripheral, but now, through a different lens, it looked very different. Detectives dug deeper. They requested Croft's old financial records, personal and professional. They found evidence that his passion for business consulting was surface level. Beneath it, he had cultivated an obsession with geology. Years of subscription payments to obscure prospecting journals, equipment purchases, rock crushers, Geiger counters, high-powered metal detectors, orders for geological mapping software. Dozens of them. What emerged was a portrait of a man with a double life. Croft had been operating under the radar, using his business as a shell to fund an illegal hobby, prospecting for valuable minerals, inside a federally protected national park. The more they investigated, the more Marcus's maps began to make sense. The language, the annotations. Some detectives initially assumed they had been written by Marcus himself, but now they suspected differently. The phrasing, the terminology, it all matched Croft's style. Marcus may have taken the maps, but Croft had likely created them. And that meant the most chilling possibility was also the simplest. Marcus hadn't discovered anything. He had been brought into something, and perhaps when he realized what Croft was truly doing, or tried to walk away, he became a liability. Now, a new theory crystallized, one that threaded together every piece of the puzzle. Croft and Dinger had gone into business together, both in consulting and in covert mineral scouting. Somewhere along the way, Marcus got cold feet. Maybe he wanted out. Maybe he'd planned to report Croft. Maybe he made the mistake of bringing Jenna along to confront him. Whatever happened out there, it ended with Jenna's death. And Marcus? He was never seen again. The partnership hadn't collapsed over mere creative differences or financial turbulence. It had imploded because Marcus Dinger, by all accounts a moral, principled man, had uncovered something dangerous. Leland Croft hadn't just betrayed a colleague, he had exploited him. The debts weighing Marcus down weren't evidence of recklessness or failure. They were deliberate weapons, leverage in a fight Marcus never wanted. And now, the so-called baby moon trip to Joshua Tree took on a far more chilling meaning. It wasn't a celebration, it was a mission. Investigators now believed Marcus had traveled to the desert with a purpose, not to unwind beneath the stars, but to expose something, to confront a man who had buried a criminal enterprise under layers of legitimacy. He likely brought with him maps, notes, samples, anything he could gather. Perhaps he hoped to find that last irrefutable piece of evidence. Or perhaps he had arranged to meet Leland Croft one final time to deliver an ultimatum in the very place the crimes were committed. Jenna, 7 months pregnant, had come along unaware of the truth. She believed it was a romantic getaway, the calm before the chaos of parenthood. But in truth, she had been drawn into a high-stakes reckoning. The camper van wasn't just a comfortable place to sleep. It was a mobile operations hub for a man preparing to blow the whistle on something worth millions. And now, Croft wasn't just a person of interest. He was the prime suspect. His motive, once unclear, now glared like sunlight off broken glass. Marcus posed a threat not just to a scheme, but to a fortune. Silencing him meant silencing Jenna, too. And in the twisted calculus of a man protecting his empire, that outcome had apparently been acceptable. Detectives turned back to one of the earliest puzzle pieces in the case. The grainy surveillance footage from a rural gas station taken days after the dingers vanished. It had long been thought to show Marcus buying supplies as he fled. But under this new light, it became something more insidious. They pulled the footage again and watched it with sharpened eyes. Though the video was degraded, the man in the frame now bore an uncanny resemblance not to Marcus, but to Leland. The same sturdy build, the same receding hairline, the same quiet mannerisms. It became sickeningly clear. The scene had been staged. Croft hadn't just killed. He had masterminded the aftermath. After murdering Marcus and Jenna, he had driven miles to a random gas station, walked inside dressed like Marcus, and purchased everything a fleeing man might buy: a burner phone, a paper atlas, snacks, and gas. All of it captured on video. All of it crafted as a false breadcrumb trail. He had conjured a fugitive out of thin air and succeeded in casting suspicion on a dead man for over a decade. Now the task force had a compelling theory, a credible motive, a timeline that explained every previously baffling decision. They had forensic leads, circumstantial connections, and geographic correlation between the burial site and the maps. But theories didn't win trials. They needed proof, tangible, indisputable evidence that could survive the courtroom. That's where the microscopic dust came in. All hopes now rested on that forensic anomaly, those particles lodged in Jenna's cervical vertebrae. If the lab could identify the substance and tie it to Leland's activities or equipment, it would be the link they needed. In the meantime, the search for Leland Croft led investigators far north, to a quiet, sun-drenched town in central Oregon. There, tucked between a bakery and a post office, stood Croft's Hardware and Feed. The shop was tidy, almost picturesque. Walls lined with seed packets and coiled hoses, the air fragrant with fertilizer and cedar mulch. When Detectives Corbin and his younger partner entered, Croft was mid-conversation with a customer about rosebush fungicide. He looked different now, heavier, hair graying, but that same calm demeanor lingered. When he saw their badges, his professional smile faltered, only slightly. They introduced themselves. He nodded slowly, feigning recognition. With a resigned sigh, he agreed to accompany them to the local station. "If this is about that old case," he said, "I'll help however I can." It was a tragedy. Inside the sterile gray-walled interrogation room, Croft settled into his seat with a controlled stillness. His hands lay neatly folded on the table, his breathing slow. He offered no resistance, no impatience. He radiated composure, the kind honed over years of carefully guarded secrets. Corbin began gently, revisiting 2011. Leland's answers were smooth, polished, unchanged. Yes, the business had ended. Yes, the financial dispute had grown tense. But that's how partnerships end sometimes. "It's like a divorce," he said with a casual shrug. "Messy, emotional, but just business." Marcus was a good man, a bit too idealistic. I was heartbroken when he disappeared. Corbin let the silence stretch before sliding a laminated full-color printout across the table. It was one of the geological maps recovered from the hidden compartment in Marcus's van. "We found this, Leland," he said. "Recognize it?" Croft leaned forward. His eyes scanned the map, his brow furrowed with affected curiosity. "Oh, this," he chuckled softly. Marcus went through a gold rush phase. Panning, meteorites, even dowsing rods. I think this was one of his projects. He believed he'd strike it rich in the desert. I told him it was nonsense. He deflected the question effortlessly, casting Marcus as a naive dreamer, himself as the voice of reason. Corbin nodded slowly. "Funny," he said. "These annotations, some match terminology from subscriptions we found in your name. Mining journals, prospecting software, mineral density tracking." Croft's smile didn't waver. "I've had a lot of hobbies over the years." The fortress held. Corbin pressed harder, laying out the timeline, the financial pressure, the aggressive legal action Croft had initiated just before the dingers disappeared. Still, Croft didn't flinch. "As I said," he replied smoothly, "that was a business matter. Things get heated, lawyers get involved. That doesn't make me a murderer." His calm was unbroken. His expression was infuriatingly neutral. What he didn't know was that 800 miles away, a forensic analyst was preparing a sealed report. The analysis of the dust embedded in Jenna's vertebrae had been completed, and the results would change everything. Every carefully presented piece of circumstantial evidence the detectives had built over months of renewed investigation was met with the same infuriating calm. Leland Croft listened with a measured gaze, his responses composed and plausible. Every time Corbin laid a card on the table, geological maps, financial records, digital reconstructions, Croft offered an explanation just reasonable enough to plant the seed of doubt. For a brief, uncomfortable moment, Corbin even questioned himself. Could they have stitched together a tapestry of coincidence and mistaken identity? Could the entire theory be wrong? Then came the knock. A uniformed officer entered the interrogation room holding a sealed evidence envelope. He passed it silently to Corbin, whose heart thudded once before he tore it open. Inside was the report from the Materials Analysis Lab, pages of dense scientific data, jargon, and charts. Corbin scanned it quickly, his eyes narrowing. When he looked up, they locked directly with Croft's. The air between them grew dense, like the moment before a thunderclap. "When the medical examiner inspected Jenna's remains," Corbin began, his voice low and steely, "she found something odd." Croft didn't blink. Corbin continued, slowly. "A fine metallic dust, embedded in the porous bone of her cervical vertebrae. We sent it to a specialized lab." He held the report up slightly, as if the weight of the truth could be physically felt. "The substance is called thorite, Leland. It's a radioactive mineral. Rare, unmistakable. It doesn't just appear. It doesn't drift in on the wind. It's found in only a handful of commercially viable concentrations in all of North America." Corbin leaned across the table, lowering his voice to a whisper. "And one of those concentrations just so happens to be located in the same remote pocket of Joshua Tree where Jenna's body was buried." The first crack in Croft's granite exterior was subtle, a flicker, barely a twitch, in his jawline. His mouth opened slightly, a dry rasp of a voice emerging. "Contamination, from the soil, coincidence." But the words lacked their former certainty. They were soft, unsure, an echo of a man who had run out of exits. Before he could recover, Corbin's younger partner slid another file across the table. Inside were 2 photographs. He opened them slowly, deliberately. "This is what really changes things," the younger detective said, his voice sharp. He tapped the first photo, a high-contrast image enhanced with cutting-edge forensic tech, showing the faint outline of a dusty footprint inside the Dinger's camper van. Then he pointed to the second image, the clean tread pattern of a red-backed geological boot. "Your preferred brand," the detective said. "We pulled your old credit card statements. You bought a pair 2 months before Marcus and Jenna disappeared." The prints matched. Exactly. Now, Croft was staring at 2 physical pieces of evidence, one that placed him at the burial site, the other inside the van. The implications bore down on him like closing jaws. No theory, no excuse, no amount of evasion could undo what the science and photos confirmed. And just like that, the man who had confidently evaded justice for 11 years crumbled. The transformation was swift and devastating. Croft slouched in his chair as if something internal had collapsed. His skin turned pale, his lips quivered. He looked down at his hands, inspecting them as if they were foreign, unrecognizable tools that had once committed unimaginable acts. Then, at last, came the breath. A long, unsteady exhale. "He wasn't supposed to bring her," he whispered. The words spilled out like water breaching a dam, a torrent of grief, guilt, and horror that had been trapped in silence for over a decade. It had started as a confrontation. Croft had suggested the meeting, furious that Marcus was threatening to ruin everything. The rare earth minerals Croft had been secretly harvesting were worth a fortune. Marcus had discovered the truth. He had brought maps, evidence, and righteousness, and Croft had brought rage. The argument escalated, voices raised, threats made. Then, in a moment of blinding fury, Croft struck Marcus with a heavy rock hammer from his toolkit. One blow. Then silence. Jenna had seen it all, her face frozen in disbelief near the van, horror etched across her features. "I didn't have a choice," Croft choked. She saw everything." He described what came next with the cold detachment of a man recounting a nightmare. Jenna had tried to run. He caught her. He killed her. He buried her quickly in a prospecting pit he had already dug nearby, likely for excavation later. Marcus's body, heavier, more cumbersome, was dumped into the yawning mouth of an old mine shaft, a place no one would stumble across. The gas station stop, he admitted, had been premeditated, his final move. He altered his appearance slightly, wore clothes Marcus might have worn, and carefully created a breadcrumb trail. A burner phone, an atlas, crumpled bills. It was a brilliant misdirection, one that had worked far longer than he ever dared hope. As the words tumbled out, the detectives said nothing. There was nothing to say. Justice didn't always roar in. Sometimes it arrived in the ragged breathing of a broken man. But even Croft's confession wasn't the end. The investigation had one more mission: the recovery of Marcus Dinger's remains. Croft had given them a detailed location, an old mine shaft, one of many in a forgotten corner of Joshua Tree. With that intel, the task force focused its search efforts on a few square miles of treacherous terrain. These shafts were centuries old, relics of a gold rush that had long passed. Vertical tombs, wooden beams cracked and rotted, stone walls on the verge of collapse. No human being could safely descend. So they brought in a team from a nearby university's robotics department. Armed with high-intensity lights and HD cameras, a fleet of small drones was deployed. One by one, they were lowered into the shafts, buzzing softly into the darkness as their lenses scanned the ancient depths. It took 2 days of methodical, cautious searching before one drone found him. Near the bottom of a collapsed vertical shaft, partially obscured by debris, lay the remains of Marcus Dinger. His skeletal frame was broken by the fall, tangled in remnants of canvas and nylon from a hiking backpack. His wedding ring, still on his finger, glittered under the drone's light. There was no ceremony, no crowds, just silence. But in that silence, there was finally truth. There was closure. For 11 years, the desert had hidden a cruel secret. But now, under the unblinking sun, that secret was finally unearthed. Justice had come, late but unrelenting. The search team moved with precision. their every step guided by the maps and confession Leland Croft had finally surrendered. Under the relentless desert heat, they moved from one abandoned mine shaft to the next, each one a relic of a bygone era and a potential tomb. Inside the mobile command vehicle parked nearby, the drone operators sat. In air-conditioned stillness, the hum of equipment blending with the low murmurs of voices. Their faces were bathed in the ghostly green light of their monitors, eyes fixed on the screens as their drones descended into the Earth's forgotten places. The feed from each shaft was transmitted in real time, filling the screens with haunting imagery. Jagged stone walls, thick roots dangling like veins from the ceiling, and the occasional bleached skeleton of an animal that had met a grim end. The shafts were hostile and lifeless, each one cloaked in an ancient silence. Again and again the drones came up empty, returning with nothing but images of rubble, collapsed beams, and suffocating darkness. But late on the second day, something changed. One drone, assigned to a narrow vertical shaft that Leland had identified by memory, began its descent. It dropped steadily, 50 feet, 75, then 100. The shaft was tight, claustrophobic, the light from the drone's LEDs piercing the gloom like a surgical blade. At approximately 150 feet, the operator's hands stilled. The camera tilted downward. Everyone in the van leaned forward. There, tangled in a chaotic mess of rotted wooden timbers and fragmented stone, was something unmistakable. A form, human, still and skeletal. The operator zoomed in, focusing the lens. The shape resolved on the screen, revealing the remains of a body lying amid the debris. Torn, dust-coated clothing still clung to parts of the frame. Bits of metal, likely a belt buckle, the faint glint of a wedding ring, reflected the harsh artificial light. No one spoke. A quiet acknowledgement passed over the radio waves. The search was over. They had found Marcus Dinger. A specialized recovery unit was dispatched immediately. Using a sophisticated system of pulleys, harnesses, and reinforced supports, the team lowered one expert after another down the unstable shaft. Hours passed. The sun dipped toward the horizon, throwing elongated shadows across the rocks. Finally, as twilight swallowed the desert in shades of indigo and rust, Marcus's remains were gently raised to the surface. 11 years after his death, he returned to the world above. Forensic technicians quickly confirmed his identity using dental records. There was no doubt. Marcus Dinger had been found. With both victims now accounted for and the full truth laid bare, the prosecution of Leland Croft proceeded swiftly. Backed by a mountain of physical evidence, expert testimony, and his own damning confession, the verdict was inevitable. He was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. For Chloe, Jenna's sister, and the family who had endured a decade of uncertainty, the conviction didn't bring joy, but it finally brought peace. The agonizing silence was broken. The long shadow lifted. They could breathe again.